Hello everybody and welcome back to the Mystery Channel. I'm your host Mr. E, and today I'd like to do a little film review. Given the Halloween season, I thought what better way to kick off my first ever review than with George Romero's 1968 classic, Night of the Living Dead. Not just a staple of the horror genre, but a true hallmark of independent filmmaking in cinematic history, with a lasting legacy that can still be seen influencing movie makers to this day. And for those of you worried about spoilers over a 55-year-old film, you can jump to this timestamp now. Our film begins with a long shot of a lone vehicle driving towards us up an isolated backcountry road, and is accompanied by a stock layer of eerie music as the opening credits play out and lead us into a title card. The car eventually pulls off into a cemetery, played by real-life Evans City Cemetery in Pennsylvania, where we're introduced to the vehicle's two occupants, Johnny and Barbara, a brother and sister that are on their way to pay respects at a grave. Johnny, played by Russell Striner, an executive producer on the film, complains to Barbara about having to make such a long drive, and the two of them engage in some incredibly realistic sibling dialogue. He also adds a throwaway line asking if they have any of that candy left, a seemingly insignificant remark that we'll revisit later. Barbara, played by Judith O'Dea, gets out and heads towards the gravestone, and as Johnny goes to follow her, the car radio snaps back on with the announcer citing technical difficulties, which alludes to some manner of interruption to their broadcast before the film even began. I have to note here that while most of their dialogue seems impressively natural and genuine, Johnny goes on a weird tangent about why the flowers here every year can't just be reused. It's very strange that the grown man doesn't seem to understand that flowers wilt and die. In fact, he even goes on to suggest that they could be fixed up with a little spit and polish. I find it so odd because of the striking contrast to the extremely human dialogue just moments before. As they finish up at the gravesite, Johnny notices a growing storm as the wind picks up around them and thunder and lightning flash across the sky. It's a wonderful bit of foreshadowing coupled with the mysterious interruption of the radio, as well as a shot of a lone man walking down the cemetery path in the background. What makes this opening sequence so wonderful is that, to paraphrase James Rolfe of Cinemassacre, most horror movies that begin in a cemetery are doing so in order to establish the plot hook. It's usually townspeople or police detectives who are investigating the scene of some grisly murder or otherwise strange occurrence that has already taken place. But here, we just have two average people going about their average lives and performing a rather average, mundane task that I think most people can relate to. As Barbara pays her respects over the grave, Johnny reminisces about coming here as children with their grandparents and jumping out to startle her from behind a bush, saying she was always a bit of a scaredy cat. When it becomes obvious Barbara's still a bit uneasy, Johnny teases her and says one of the most memorable lines in all of cinema history.
"They're coming to get you, Barbara."
Johnny teases Barbara relentlessly with that line, following her from headstone to headstone and even going so far as to point out that lone figure on the path, stating, "Look, there's one of them now." Barbara scolds him for being so rude that the man might overhear him, but Johnny kind of jogs ahead past the figure, and then the man suddenly lunges towards Barbara and attacks her. It was an absolutely brilliant decision, I think, to have the random guy that Johnny just so happened to be pointing out turn out to be the real thing after all. Johnny rushes back to help his sister and fights off the strange man, seemingly having the upper hand before he's pulled down and, ironically, killed when his head strikes the corner of a grave marker. The first on-screen death in the film is an accident. Bill Heinzman plays the creature, whose iconic rictus face leers up at Barbara, causing her to flee in terror and try to get back to the car. Here we see what might have been one of the very first instances of the classic girl chased by a killer and falling down routine. Making it to the car, Barbara realizes that Johnny has the keys and starts locking the doors as the zombie approaches. He beats and bashes against the windows, even trying the handles, and interestingly enough, in contrast to modern zombies, he shows some level of intelligence by picking up a brick and smashing through the window. Screaming for her life, Barbara releases the brakes on the car and begins to coast down the cemetery hill, and a slight bit of continuity error as the car seemed to be parked on flat ground. She keeps looking back at the man chasing her and coasts off the road, crashing into a tree. The car had apparently been in an accident between the first and second days of shooting, and so during the chase scene, they deliberately ignored the left-hand side until it could be worked into the script. As Barbara flees on foot, she comes to a field where she sees an old farmhouse in the distance, a symbol of hope in the moment, but it's arguable that this bastion of safety may turn out to be a prison in the future. Scrambling around the outside of the house, she also passes an exterior hatch into the cellar, an oversight that we will be coming back to later. Finally making it into the house, we're treated to the excellent use of lighting in this film. There's truly something about black and white movies that captures an atmosphere better than color ever could. Maybe it's because since we see in color, it instantly transports us to a world that is strange, alien, and unnerving. Upon exploring the house, Barbara finds that there's been some form of activity recently, finding hastily toppled furnishings and various items strewn across the floor. Moving from one room into the next, we're given a sudden sting in the music as the camera flashes to several animal heads mounted on the walls, a shot I suspect must have influenced the Evil Dead. Passing by a window, it is also revealed that there's more than one of those creatures outside as 2 more zombies shamble up from the tree line. Desperate to find a hiding place, Barbara begins to move upstairs, giving us another fantastically dynamic shot as the shadows of the banister cloak half of her face before she screams, revealing the grisly fate of the former occupant of the house. Filled with panic, Barbara runs outside into danger, only to be blinded by headlights as a newcomer arrives and ushers her back inside the house. The newcomer is a man named Ben, though we won't know that for some time, and he's played excellently by Dwayne Jones in what some considered to be a controversial casting choice for the time period. Romero himself, however, has stated that he chose Jones for the role because he was the best actor that auditioned. Ben proves to be a rather capable man, quickly assessing their situation and hurriedly mounting a defense of the house by boarding up doors and windows. Barbara seems to be slipping into a state of shock as she closes off, stops talking, and becomes relatively unhelpful. In a scene that I don't think was intended to be funny, but does kind of come off as funny, Ben quits trying to get Barbara to help him and just goes outside to blow off some steam by beating the crap out of a couple of zombies with a tire iron. During this altercation, a third zombie slips into the house and attacks Barbara, but Ben enters and dispatches it with a foreshadowing blow to its skull. What happens next is an amazing sequence as Ben peers out the door at yet another zombie shambling towards the house, only for it to stumble aside and reveal not 1 or 2, but numerous walking corpses, drastically shifting the tone of the film from a strange, seemingly isolated incident into a full-blown epidemic. Another oddly comical moment, Ben drags the corpse of the zombie he just killed outside and sets it on fire to ward off the others. It's only amusing to me because I have no idea why he would assume that it's flammable, but it goes up in flames without any real effort, so kudos to him. Another off-color moment is when Barbara gets on Ben's last nerve and he almost swears at her, but controls himself. Remember, even during a zombie apocalypse, you should always mind your manners in front of a lady. The following scene shows Barbara milling around the house aimlessly, not unlike the creatures outside, when she opens a music box and we're treated to a very creepy shot of her eye through the open doors of the box itself as the haunting melody plays out. After a good amount of effort, Barbara finally manages to be helpful, and Ben continues to secure the house, boarding up more doors, more windows, and reinforcing everything as best as he can. What comes next is an incredibly long and drawn-out scene of exposition, wherein both Ben and Barbara give us some backstory. But, interestingly enough, some of the things they say don't make a lot of sense. Ben will talk about seeing scores of zombies hanging off the back of a truck that was on fire, but we already know that they're afraid of fire. It's questionable, but we didn't get to see the events he's talking about, so we have no choice but to believe him. Barbara, on the other hand, eventually does start talking and gives us a completely inaccurate recount of our opening scene. She references Johnny asking about the candy, but puts an amazing amount of detail and emphasis into it that just didn't happen, almost as if she's imagining him as a child and not the grown man that he was. Also, she muddles details about his teasing her and the attack of the original zombie. It's kind of funny here because Barbara sat quietly listening to Ben give his exposition, but when Barbara starts giving hers, Ben just looks annoyed. It's kind of great. Eventually, Barbara will work herself into a complete frenzy, insisting that they leave the house to go find Johnny. Ben, fully aware that there's no chance he could have survived, refuses, and she becomes so unhinged that she slaps him. Another moment of controversy as Ben ain't having that shit, and he hauls off and smacks her back, causing her to faint. If the idea of a black man taking the lead role in a predominantly white film was bad enough during the 60s, seeing a black man strike a white woman would have had some audiences at the time howling for blood. I'm not sure if Dwayne Jones ever received any threats or hate mail for the role, but given that it was known to happen to other actors at the time, I wouldn't be surprised. It was a very ballsy stance for the actors and filmmakers to take. With Barbara more or less out of the way for the time being, Ben is finally able to get some work done. Finding an old radio, he manages to tune in for an emergency broadcast, which is acknowledging the events taking place. He also sets himself to the task of continuing to shore up his defenses, dousing a chair in kerosene and pushing it out the door to ward off zombies. During his renewed defense, Ben exposes a modest door built into the wall, and the camera pans in to focus on it. One of my favorite moments, Ben finally sits down to have a rest and just smokes a cigarette. Like, somebody get that man a beer. While enjoying his well-earned break, our hero realizes that this is a redneck's home, and that can only mean one thing. There's gotta be a gun in the house. And sure enough, there is. Finding a box of bullets, Ben locks and loads for the next hour or so of this movie. Finally getting strapped seems to really put him in a good mood, because my man even brings Barbara some shoes, and goes so far as to put them on her feet for her. True credit to Dwayne Jones, because he comes off as a guy that really has a handle on the situation, a man you can put your faith in to keep your head above water. Another little tidbit about this scene is that in the background we can see a window that wasn't boarded up. Many people claim that this is an oversight, but the filmmakers have said that the window actually looked out over a steep slope, so it made sense not to waste boards on it. If there was a scene showing us that slope from the outside, it got cut from the film. As Ben works his way around the house and Barbara kind of just sits comatose, the voice on the radio finally says what we've all been thinking. The creatures seem to be recently deceased corpses, and they apparently feed on the flesh of their victims. Interestingly enough, this is the very first zombie movie in which zombies actually eat human flesh. And also interesting, the term zombie is never used in the film, although they are referred to as ghouls later. The camera finally cuts back to that interior door from earlier, and it begins to open as two men enter the scene. Harry Cooper, played by Carl Hardman, and Tom, played by Keith Wayne. Their arrival startles Barbara into a panic, summoning Ben from the upstairs. The scene plays out, again, somewhat comically, as we find out that the two men, along with two more women and a young girl, have been inside the house this entire time, hiding in the basement cellar. Cooper immediately sets about fiddling with the radio and essentially acting like he's been in charge this whole time, while Ben fumes over the fact that he really could have used some help earlier, and Tom just sort of stands there trying to placate both of them. A long back and forth ensues between the two men, arguing about whether everybody should stay up here or move collectively down to the cellar. Ben argues that upstairs is more defensible, whereas Cooper argues that the cellar is not only hidden, but it also has only a single point of entry for them to worry about. Ben calls that a death trap. The entire premise of their argument is built on the crux of there being absolutely no back exit to the cellar. Their argument is cut short as a pack of zombies begin trying to bust through the window, their hands grabbing at the men inside. Tom slashes away at one of the creatures with a knife, mutilating its hand and showing genuine signs of shock at the realization that it's completely unfazed by this. Ben fires his rifle into another zombie, which stumbles backwards and returns to the assault. He shoots it again to no effect, and finally, with the third shot, hits it in the head and it drops, cementing the idea that you have to damage the brain in order to kill them. We're next treated to an exterior shot of the growing horde of walking corpses shambling towards the house. The zombies are displayed in various states of dress, ranging from everyday clothes to towels or hospital gowns, to one zombie who is completely naked. It's a great shot because it drives home the concept of being sort of frozen in time, a morbid sense of suspended animation. Whatever they were wearing or doing when they died, or more specifically when they returned, is exactly how they'll stay forever. Quick side note, one of the shamblers is seen stopping to eat a bug off a tree. She was played by Marilyn Eastman, the real-life partner of Carl Hardman, as well as the actress pulling double duty in the role of Hardman's on-screen wife Helen, who we have yet to see. I just really love the fact that so many people, both in front of and behind the camera, stepped up to help make the film a success. Cooper decides that he's had enough and he's going back down to the cellar. He tries to take the radio, some food, and even Barbara, but Ben lays down the law and tells him to go on and get, stating that if he's fighting up here, it means he's fighting for everything that's up here with him. Dwayne Jones really is just a boss in this movie. When Cooper tries to play the sympathy card by mentioning his child, Ben goes for the throat and basically just says, "Sucks for your kid that her daddy is so stupid." It's more that weird humor in the middle of this very tense moment. Tom finally decides that he's sticking with Ben, and who can blame him, so he calls his girlfriend Judy, played by Judith Ridley, up from the cellar. As Cooper secures himself in the basement, we're finally introduced to his wife Helen and their daughter Karen, played by Kira Shawn, Hardman's daughter in real life, who also played the mangled corpse upstairs that was discovered by Barbara. Karen is currently sick, but nobody knows why. As the scene plays out, Helen begins to berate and belittle her husband for locking the three of them in the cellar, accusing him of being prideful and always having to have it his way. She also drops an offhanded line about how they may not enjoy living together, but dying together won't solve their problems, insinuating that their marriage is struggling. The film really tries very hard to convince us that Cooper's plan is doomed to fail. Moments later, Tom calls down and says that Ben's managed to find a television and wants to get it working. In the middle of the back and forth between Harry and Helen, there's just a hard cut between frames that was apparently made because the filmmakers thought the scene dragged on too long. Helen says that if Judy will come down and sit with Karen, she and Cooper could go upstairs, which kind of starts this weird ring around the rosy aspect of the film where various members of the cast duck in and out for others. Helen sits down to watch Barbara as the men work on the TV, and she lights a cigarette, causing Barbara to suddenly snap her head in Helen's direction and stare at her like a complete loon. As the TV is finally hauled in and set up, Cooper shouts at Barbara to pay close attention to the broadcast. When Ben flashes him a dirty look, Cooper claims that he doesn't want anybody's life on his hands. Ben lays down the law once again, saying,
I don't want to hear any more from you, mister. If you stay up here, you take orders from me, and that includes leaving the girl alone.
As the TV comes on, it has no sound, and Cooper quickly overcomes being scolded and tells the men to play with the rabbit ears. Normal enough at the time, but watching back now, it's a lovely reminder of how things used to be. The television broadcast itself goes on for quite a long time, and mostly tells us what we already know, repeating the idea that the creatures eat flesh and so on. Here, however, they do speculate on the cause of the strange outbreak, and the film loses me just a little bit. It chooses to go, or at least lean, in an explicitly science fiction direction, speculating that the events taking place may have been caused by a piece of satellite debris that had orbited too close to Venus and brought back an exceedingly high level of radiation. I'm not saying I would have preferred a story take on a more occult or supernatural theme, but the sci-fi angle just doesn't do it for me. The real takeaway from the broadcast, however, is that the recently deceased themselves seem to be raising up, and a list of rescue stations is provided for our group, and the survivors begin to formulate a plan on how to escape and make their way to safety. We're also given a long scene of reporters following a general out of a meeting in the White House, in which we can see the streets of Washington, D.C., which looks perfectly fine for some reason. We're given some quick exposition of Tom and Judy and how they arrived here and how they passed a gas pump nearby, which the group will use to fuel their vehicle. However, everything keeps cutting back and forth between the group talking and the TV talking and the people leaving to change out for others, and it becomes a very muddy sequence to follow. Ben plans on leading a charge to an abandoned truck and the gas pump, while Cooper covers him from the windows upstairs. Tom, who had left earlier, returns, having found some keys that he hopes are to the pump, and states that he knows how to drive a truck, so Ben chooses him to go with him. Before they go, we have a rather sappy, Dark Shadows-esque soap opera scene between the young lovers Tom and Judy. I'm sure they'll be fine. A solemn scene unfolds as Ben and Tom begin unboarding the front door while Cooper gets in position upstairs to provide cover. Tom gives one last look towards Judy as Cooper begins tossing Molotov cocktails onto the zombies below, with the music ramping up at each explosion until it's whipped into a frenzy of horns and strings. Our heroes dash outside amidst the chaos, with Tom jumping into the driver's seat as Ben covers him with his rifle. Until suddenly, at the last minute, Judy rushes outside and tries to join the two men. Cooper, having come downstairs to hold the door, tries to stop her before finally giving up and just shoving her outside and locking the door behind her. With no other options, Ben reluctantly tells her to come on. Ben seems to forget the headshot rule as he pops another zombie in the chest before jumping into the bed of the truck with a makeshift torch, and the vehicle becomes a literal and metaphorical chariot of fire as Tom drives away while Ben brandishes his flames at the horde of corpses. As they arrive at the pump, Ben makes his one and only overtly stupid decision in the film by setting down his torch right next to the back wheel of the truck. As Tom struggles to unlock the gas pump, Ben just straight up shoots it with his gun, and Tom grabs the pump handle with an uncontrollable stream of gasoline starting to flow out of it, which douses the truck and is caught fire by the nearby torch. Tom fears the imminent explosion of the gas pump, so he hops inside the still flaming vehicle alongside Judy and begins driving away. Eventually, he slams on the brakes and tells Judy they gotta get out of there, but she claims her jacket is stuck, and so Tom comes back inside and they waste enough time for the flames to reach the gas tank and explode, killing both of them. We're then treated to another unintentionally funny shot of Ben's face looking at the explosion like, oh shit. Alone outside with the horde, Ben fights his way back to the house, ducking and diving through the wall of bodies where we see one standout that has an oddly Frankenstein look to his makeup. It should be stated that pretty much all the zombies in the film look fairly normal, with only a few minor details to help warp their appearance into looking more rictus or rotted or out of place. Not at all like the twisted, jaw-hanging, half-off zombies of modern films. These are supposed to look like fairly regular people around the time of their turning, so why does this one guy look like Frankenstein? The world may never know. Ben eventually makes it back to the house, only to find that Cooper has locked him outside. He bangs on the door, desperately pleading for the man to let him in, but Cooper is a Weasley little shit and keeps waffling between helping Ben or running down into the cellar. Fed up with all this, Ben just straight up kicks in the door and even stops to give the whinging Cooper an "oh, you done fucked up" kind of glare before slamming the door closed and trying to board it back up. Cooper, having finally grown a pair of balls, comes to help Ben secure the door, and the two men work together to hold back the encroaching zombies until it is secure, at which point Ben hauls off and starts beating the shit out of Cooper. He hits him 3 times, the first of which was with his ring hand, and then he picks him up off the floor and hits him a 4th time for good measure. Damn. Outside in the burning wreckage, the zombie horde descends on the charred corpses of Tom and Judy as they begin ripping apart pieces of their bodies. Here, the film finally lives up to its original working title, Night of the Flesh Eaters. While the shadows of the interior hide most of the gore, we are then given a long shot of various zombies walking away from the smoldering vehicle, feasting on various pieces of organs, meat, body parts, and intestines. The defeated group of survivors half-heartedly throw out different suggestions for how to escape, while Barbara interjects that Johnny still has the keys. During this scene, it is revealed that Karen became sick after one of the creatures grabbed and bit her. The second and final television broadcast comes on and confirms the idea for radiation as a cause of the outbreak, officially pushing the film into the realm of pseudo-science fiction. During the broadcast, we're introduced to Sheriff McClelland, played by George Cassana, as he organizes a posse of men who seem to be enjoying the zombie hunt and taking it all just fine. The sheriff is being interviewed by real-life TV presenter Bill Chilly Billy Cardile, who is playing himself in the movie. The broadcast overall isn't terribly illuminating, it just reaffirms the idea of shooting the zombies in the head or burning them. It does tell us that there's an active force on its way, and gives us this great line by Cassana as he describes the state of the zombies in question.
Yeah, they're dead. They're all messed up.
The final act of the movie is ushered in with a power outage, shrouding the survivors in darkness. A close-up of Cooper reveals that Ben punched him so hard the bruise on his cheek resembles that of a burn scar. Cooper also implies that Ben is responsible for the deaths of Tom and Judy, that he needs to take his gun away. Outside, the zombies mirror the car scene from the start of the film by arming themselves with bricks and boards and anything they can get their undead hands on to use as a weapon as they begin laying siege to the house. Ben does what he can to hold them back, and even Helen tries to help hold a door, but Cooper stands back watching. As Ben cries out to him for help, he drops his gun and Cooper takes it, threatening him. Ben throws one of the broken boards at Cooper, giving him an opening to wrestle the gun away. Cooper backs into a corner defeated, and Ben cocks the rifle, shooting the unarmed man as Helen watches impassively. We're then given a shot of Ben's face as he realizes that he just killed a man as easily and uncaringly as the creatures outside. Helen is grabbed by arms breaking through the door behind her as her husband stumbles backwards into the cellar, struggling desperately in his final moments to reach his unconscious daughter. While Helen struggles against the undead, Barbara spots the face of that original zombie who attacked her in the cemetery and flies into a rage, grabbing that broken board and bashing at the arms holding Helen. Mrs. Cooper is able to escape now that the creatures are latching onto Barbara instead, and she flees to the cellar where she finds her daughter Karen, now awake and feasting on the corpse of her father. Broken by the image, Helen refers to her daughter as "poor baby," while Karen slowly walks towards her, grabbing a brick trowel off the wall and begins to ruthlessly murder her mother, while strangely warped and twisted screams cry out of Helen. It's probably the most haunting moment of the film, at least to me. Back upstairs, Ben and Barbara continue to fight back the zombies until the barricade is completely broken and the walking corpse of Johnny steps into the doorway. A horrified Barbara stands frozen as the image of her own brother grabs her, pulling her into the writhing mass of bodies and bites into her throat. Ben is forced to retreat from the front of the room and is attacked from behind by Karen. Throwing the girl off of him, in the film's greatest moment of irony, Ben goes down into the cellar and bars the door, proving that Mr. Cooper was actually right all along. Our last scene of Ben's escape is seeing Bill Heinzman's original zombie, along with little Karen, standing next to each other as they beat at the cellar door while scores of the living dead file into the house around them. As Ben moves away from the door and deeper into the cellar, he is met with the grisly fate of the Coopers. When the mangled corpse of Harry starts to rise up, Ben shoots him, not once or twice, but 3 times, probably suggesting his resentment of the character. By the time Helen's eyes pop open, Ben gives her just a single shot and throws his gun away, possibly tormented by the realization of how easy killing can be. Ben braces himself for a last stand against the zombies, but eventually they just give up and stop beating against the door. As the dawn breaks over the next morning, we see helicopters in the sky and lines of men fanning out across the fields, the hunting posse still tracking down and rounding up the undead. Sheriff McClellan seems to think that they'll reach the town of Willard within a few hours, and the newsmen remark that everything seems to be under control. Inside the cellar, Ben can hear the barking of dogs, the blaring of sirens, and the shooting of guns, leaving him to believe that at long last, help has finally arrived. As the posse approaches, they pass the ruined truck where Tom and Judy died, and the sheriff makes a nasty remark that somebody had a cookout last night. We watch as the men shoot down straggling zombies with as much enthusiasm as if it were an everyday activity. As Ben slowly makes his way up from the cellar, he cautiously approaches the front window to see what's going on outside. In the most twisted of twist endings, the sheriff spots movement inside the house and tells one of his men, Vince, to shoot it in the head. And he does! Ben survived the entire night only to be shot dead by his own rescuers. The weight and shock of this scene is met with the sheriff delivering his most humdrum and empathetic line of the movie.
Good shot.
Okay, he's dead. Let's go get him. That's another one for the fire.
The film ends and the credits crawl as radio static and eerie music play over grainy, still images of the posse members using meat hooks to drag Ben's body outside to be burned with all the others. In these last moments, we see Ben's face next to that of the original zombie from the start of the movie. The slideshow cuts back to moving film for one final scene of the burning pyre before the screen finally fades to black. And thus concludes our presentation of Night of the Living Dead. Is it a perfect movie? No, not by any stretch of the imagination. It's chock full of continuity issues, oddball characters, and some questionable acting. But considering the fact that this film was only made on a budget of around $125,000 and was comprised of mostly up-and-coming talent in the industry, or locals who just wanted to have a shot in a movie, I think that these mistakes are fairly minor. The film itself marked Romero's first feature-length project, and to do such an amazing job without any form of studio backing or involvement really speaks to not just the awesome power of the picture, but also the people involved in making it. On the surface level, Living Dead is just a campy little B-movie about a group of random people getting attacked by zombies. But if you look under the hood, you can clearly see the inner workings of something great. The lighting and visuals throughout the film are just phenomenal, and the murky undertones of social commentary is simply brilliant. I've heard that Dwayne Jones had wanted the character of Harry Cooper to have more racial prejudices against Ben, but Romero argued that the message would be louder if left unsaid. I'm not entirely sure if that's true, and Romero himself has gone back and said that it might have been a mistake not to add that element to the movie, but I don't think that it takes a particularly politically minded person to appreciate some of the more subtle messages that the film tries to get across. I also appreciate that none of the women in the film are relegated to just a damsel in distress. Granted, Romero films don't typically feature the best female characters ever seen, and you're certainly never going to see a gun-toting badass like Ripley from Alien. But the simple nature of undying loyalty from Judith, or the willingness to help from Helen, and even poor, damaged Barbara finally having enough and going ballistic on some zombies is a really nice touch. And the zombies themselves are a real work of art, though maybe not in the way you think. Whether it's because of vision or because of budget, the minimalistic design of the creatures makes them a bit more haunting and seem a bit more realistic in a sense, especially compared to a lot of what you get today. They're weird and unnatural and unnerving. Sometimes less really is more. It's also worth noting that, as I said in the intro, this film was made in 1968, and yet it feels so much like the old Universal classics such as Frankenstein, Dracula, and The Wolfman, which were all huge back in the 30s and 40s. It really manages to cross a sort of bridge between the old and the new, which I think is a big part of why it's considered to be such an iconic film. Another reason for the film having such a great reach and cultural impact is the fact that it's public domain. I mentioned earlier that the original name of the movie was going to be Night of the Flesh Eaters, and when the filmmakers changed the title, they screwed up the property rights. Arguably, though, it's the fact that it is public domain that essentially skyrocketed the movie's popularity because everybody could play it. Technically speaking, I could have uploaded the entire film and just talked over it. It's available everywhere. Because I don't want this to drag on too long, I'm going to go ahead and close out now with just a few final thoughts. I think it's obvious why the film has earned its place in movie history, and why it was so successful at creating its own genre. The film is brilliant in a lot of ways, and somebody once said that its successes are visionary and its failures are budgetary. Now, I'm not going to reduce the picture down to a numerical rating, but I will say this. Whether you're a student of film or a lover of movies or just looking for something spooky to throw on for Halloween, I can't recommend this film enough. It's a stone-cold classic. So, with all that being said, thank you everybody for joining me here today on the Mystery Channel. I've been your host, Mr. E, and I'd like to wish you all a very happy Halloween. I'll see you all again soon. Bye-bye.